Okay, so at the start of the year, we all in class opened our Kinder Eggs, and I got a toucan. So that gave me the idea for a game in which you jump really high, so you can get over massive obstacles, which led to me deciding on a pogo stick as the main mechanic of my game. But I wanted something more exciting than just a normal old pogo stick, so I went with a pogo stick that has dynamite strapped to it, so you can explode in different directions, as well as like up and down. It's a really unique movement system, but it's also based in a more arcade style, so the player still feels like they have a lot of control. From the first release, Explogo already had a really addictive quality to its movement. It was just fun to move around in the space. Similar to when people first played Mario 64 and couldn't stop running around in Peach's castle. After refining the movement system several times, it was time to get to work on the first level, which meant coding an enemy, modelling a building, and implementing an end goal area. The first level was hugely important to the base mechanic of Explogo, as I quickly realised it was still incredibly clunky to play precisely. Seeing people test the game after my second release made me realise they still don't have enough control. So I increased the base movement speed hugely, increased the jump height, and changed how the boom boost added force to the player. Initially, the boom boost would simply add force to the player in the chosen direction of left, right, forward, back. This was frustrating to players, however, because it meant they couldn't use the boom boost to counteract their current momentum. So if the player was being flung in one direction, they wouldn't be able to just boost in the opposite direction, like it wouldn't feel satisfying, they'd just stop in midair. I therefore edited the code so the boom boost would freeze your momentum, then add force in the direction you chose. This meant the ability was more reliable because it always pushed you at a fixed rate regardless of other forces. However, this meant I had to change the cooldown on it, so now the boom boost doesn't reset upon hitting a wall. Otherwise you could just bounce up buildings infinitely. The cooldown icons on the heads-up display. At some point I realised that I understand how the abilities refreshed, but the player would just be guessing the whole time. This was a nice aesthetic way of illustrating that to the player. The next big feature was the high score system. Simply putting a timer in the top right corner and showing who got the best time made the next release of Explogo, if you'll pardon the pun, explode. There were people crowding around my game watching people speedrun it, getting all competitive and making jokes about the legendary sub-10 run. Seeing that passion sparked the implementation of the next feature of Explogo, the collectible TNT. While it was fun seeing them perfect a certain route, I wasn't happy on how lackluster the variety of runs was. In the speedrunning community, there are generally two ways to run a game, any percent and 100%. I wanted more variety from the speedruns, so I added the ability to collect 3 pieces of TNT throughout the level. There are leaderboards for regular and all TNT. This would add some incentive for players to actually explore the levels more to try and get all of the bits of TNT hidden around, as beforehand they were simply jumping from one building to the last one, abusing the movement system. I didn't want it to be another generic collectathon, so I took some inspiration from Mario Odyssey. In Explogo, you have to collect at least 1 TNT before you can beat the game. This means you have to do some level of exploration, but it doesn't force you to go scour the whole level over and over again to find all of the TNT. Player choice is most important here. At this point, I quickly realised that my game still had no main menu, so I implemented that using the same theming as the rest of the game. In the background of the main menu, you can see the skyline of the first level, giving players a feel for the theme of the game from the get-go. Up until this point, for all of the releases of Explogo, I had been simply showing the controls in the top left-hand corner of the screen. This isn't how you should teach the player how to play your game, so I decided to implement a full tutorial. This was just to slowly go through the mechanics one by one with the player, introducing them sequentially so the player didn't feel overwhelmed and could really understand what all of the abilities were for. Now that I have the full structure for the game in place, it was time to make the rest of the levels. This was mostly really simple, just adding more buildings in different orientations, but I also wanted to add a few more mechanics. The most notable ones being the enemies in the game, the sort of white robotic blobs that follow you around and try and bounce you off the map, and the boom fuel, which is a glowing orange orb hovering in space that you can use to reset all of your abilities. Apart from this, most of the work just came in the level design. Coming up with unique orientations for levels was tricky, but given the unique movement system, it wasn't that hard to think of different ways you can utilize it in different interesting ways. Code review. I think I might actually put that one in if I had some effects. So let's start with the basic movement script, which was the first thing implemented in the game. The most basic movement ability I added was simply jumping, which is this here. If the player has recently hit the ground, so if bounced is equal to false, this will launch the player upwards. It will add force to the rigid body of Nitro, as well as instantiating an explosion prefab and playing an explosion sound effect. I didn't have those originally, it was originally just adding force upwards, but I didn't have those in originally, but added them later to make it feel much more powerful. And obviously it changes bounce to true at the end, so that if you hit space, it makes bounce true, and then you can't do it again until you eventually hit the ground, which is this code here. It checks if the tag is floor, and if it is floor, then bounced will equal false. The next movement ability I implemented was the boom boost, which shoots the player in a given direction depending on which key, in which direction they're holding. So out of W, S, and D, if they're holding A, then they'll shoot left when they press the left mouse button. If they're holding S, they'll get shot backwards when they press the left mouse button, etc, etc. I have an if statement at the top to check if move allowed is true. This is used in other scripts, which stops the player from moving if they're in a menu at the end of a level. At the bottom here, you'll see this is also, because of a later implementation, it tells the player the cooldown of boom boost. So setting it to clear will show the player that it's empty. You can't use it again until you hit the ground again, which will of course give its color back. The next movement option I implemented is the fast fall. This works a fair bit differently to the main movement options in that if you're able to get the fast fall back as soon as you hit the ground, you could essentially just hold it down and force your way through the ground. So I also had to add a little cooldown in between each time you use fast fall, so that way there's at least a half-second period between fast falls, so you can't just immediately just keep pushing yourself through the geometry. Apart from that, it works the same as the other movement options. It just adds a velocity onto the player, plays a sound, and instantiates the particle effect, as well as clearing the cooldown icon on the heads-up display. The next thing I implemented was a camera pull script. So the problem with having a third-person character in your game is that when you turn around, your camera just gets pushed through the geometry and you can see through all of the walls. Obviously you don't want that. That doesn't look good at all. So I created a camera pull script which detects whether or not the camera is currently has currently entered a piece of geometry, and then there's a little leeway time before it pushes it in, and then it will tween the camera movements towards an object close to the player, not the player itself, otherwise you could just see through the player. The next thing I had to work on was the center collision. So in a lot of playtests I noticed that all of the players were just getting stuck in the floor quite easily, because you can still apply quite a lot of force and just jam yourself in the floor, and they're just constant explosions. It doesn't look pretty at all. So I implemented a center collision script on a game object in the main character, a small ball right at the bottom. So in normal gameplay you won't be able to notice that at all. It won't collide with anything, but if the character is literally inside of the geometry, that will be activated, and then it'll activate this code. So if it realizes that it's touching some geometry, it will count up, and by the time it's counted to 10, it will decide to push the main character up ever so slightly, over and over again, because it keeps counting up to 10 and it keeps pushing them up further and further until they're out of the geometry. Obviously it doesn't work that slowly. It will push the character up really, really quickly. The player will barely notice it, and it just means the main character won't get stuck in the geometry at all, really, because as soon as it happens, they're just immediately pushed out. The next big coding challenge I faced was in the high scores script. All this does is show the top 3 fastest times at the end of each level, but as it turns out, that's a little trickier than I first thought. So in order to save the times over multiple scenes, so you can exit out the game and come back and you still have your high scores all saved, I had to use player preferences to store all of the different high scores, which wasn't too difficult, but I did have to create a for loop, which wasn't too difficult outside of using it for the first few times. The main issue was ordering the scores. I had to use the push and pop method in a for loop in order to push the scores below it further down and even just off the table completely if it weren't high enough. I later realized that the method I was using to save the player preferences didn't actually work for later levels, because they were all saved as the same name across all of the scenes. So I had to attach the name of the scene at the start of each player preference, so it saves it as a separate variable, and you can have different high scores across all of the different levels. Naturally, once I had the high score system completed, and I implemented collectibles, I had to create a complete high score leaderboard, which initially checked if the player did have all of the collectibles in a level, and then all it would do separately is it would attach HC to the start of player preference with the high score instead of just H or nothing. The last large script I had to work with involving a lot of logic is the tutorial script. This was overall quite simple to make. It just involved a lot of copy and pasting of the same sort of code, which was simply activating an animation to show the text on screen so it would shoot up the screen, and then disabling and enabling the current text that wants to be shown, so that it's not all popping up at the same time, and then once the player is out of the current tutorial hitbox, it will then activate the end script, which will crossfade out the current text so the screen is completely clear, and reset the animation, as well as removing the object so that the player couldn't just go back and constantly reset the tutorial over and over again. Okay, I think I'm done.